Today, I want to speak about one of my favorite topics, and it's very dear to my heart because the reason is that having been in the corporate world for 20 years, you always are facing some type of cognitive dissonance between things that are happening in the workplace and the the person that you want to be. And what is weird also is that I was reading a study coming from the Ethics and Compliance Initiative that despite the fact that 99% of employees believe it is super important for the leaders to be ethical, only 76% of employees feel their leaders are highly ethical, which is quite a problem. In fact, there is a big gap that underscores the urgent need for a greater emphasis on ethical leadership in practice. And this is what I want to discuss. And I found the appropriate person. And I say the appropriate person because there needs to be a type of shape that understands this difference between being compliant with the rule and being good, doing good things. And Brian Beckcom, my guest today, is a mix of everything. From one side, he's a computer scientist, he's also a philosopher, and also a lawyer based in Houston, Texas. Um, and he's quite impressive because also his company, his firm, VB Attorneys, and you can see that in his t-shirt. Nice t-shirt, by the way, Brian.
Thank you very much.
VB Attorneys is considered one of the best law firms in the United States, which is impressive. Brian, I really want to thank you for taking the time to spend with me and having a discussion about this precious topic for me. Now, Brian, how does it come that you got, first of all, so many interests, computer science, philosophy, and law? How did you end up there?
I thank you for that introduction, Ivan. That's very kind of you. The computer science and philosophy and law, a lot of that is luck, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So, I think so. When I was the biggest thing that happened, I think the most formative thing that happened in my life is when I was 5 years old. My brother was three. My mom got terminal breast cancer, and so I saw her kind of waste away over 5 years. She died when I was 10. And I think, there's a lot of studies that show that if you lose a parent or you suffer some sort of really tragic event when you're younger, it really shapes your life. And that really shaped my life. It made me very, very curious. And of course, this is not conscious when I'm 10, 12 years old, but it made me very conscious, very thoughtful about big questions. Like, when you start thinking about, for example, when my mother died, I started that my dad was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. And when he went off to work, I was just praying that he would come back, because if he didn't, I would be an orphan. And so when you're 10 and 12 and you start pondering these types of questions, it kind of sets you on a path. And so, and I didn't even realize it did that. When I was in high school, I was an athlete. I played basketball. I was an all-district player. I ended up going to Texas A&M to play basketball, and that was all I cared about. I really didn't care. I made good grades, but I never had to study. It was a lot easier back then. But I show up at Texas A&M. I don't have a major, and these computer things. This is in the early 1990s. These personal computers were just starting to become known, and I like computers. It was fun to me, and so I started taking some computer classes. I really enjoyed it. And I was like, maybe I'll just study computer science. And in the computer science department at Texas A&M at the time, you were required to take another major or another degree. Most people took math, physics, electrical engineering, stuff like that. I had taken a philosophy course or two and was absolutely enraptured by philosophy, mainly because I think it asks important questions, like big, big questions. A lot of the, a lot of the my friends in college, all they were cared about was chasing girls and drinking beer. And I cared about that a lot too, but I also cared about these big questions. So I ended up studying computer science in college and philosophy, kind of almost by accident in a way. I kind of just studied what I was interested in. And I tell people today, Ivan, I say, it really, unless you want to be like something super specific, like some sort of doctor or something, it doesn't matter what you major in college. It really doesn't. What you should do is you should chase what you're interested in. It makes everything so much easier. You'll learn way better. And that's what I did. And now it turns out, Ivan, I didn't know this at the time. The original computer scientists were philosophers by and large, just like the original scientists were philosophers. In fact, they used to call it, there was no word for science 100 years ago. They called it natural philosophy. Like Isaac Newton considered himself a natural philosopher. And the thing that I think is so cool about philosophy is everybody thinks physics is the fundamental science, and it's not. It's philosophy, because philosophy is the branch of science that ask the important questions. And in order to do physics or chemistry or biology or computer science or mathematics, you have to know what questions to ask first, right? So traditionally, in the scientific community, it's the philosophers that kind of ask the questions, and the scientists go out and try to answer those questions. So it was really kind of luck. But I tell you what, and then I end up going to law school. I have a funny story about how I ended up doing that. But I got so lucky in a way because I was on the cutting edge of the personal computing revolution. Plus, I studied philosophy and law, and all of these things now are converging. And let me give you a couple examples of what I mean by that. Artificial intelligence. There's a ton of discussion about the ethics behind artificial intelligence. I don't know all the answers to AI, but I do know what the questions are. And I also know that people that own technology companies are not necessarily the best people to answer these questions. So if you're Elon Musk, whatever you think about Elon Musk, he has incentives to answer these questions in a certain way. Number one. Number two, as far as I know, he has no philosophical training at all. He may be a great tech person, just like Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or Bill Gates. They may be great tech people, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're good at ethics and morality. It doesn't mean they're not, but it doesn't mean they are. And I think a lot of the times we assume that because these people build these technological marvels, that they're also better at the ethics, and they're not. We need philosophers right now more than ever. We need ethicists right now more than ever, because we're about to face, in my opinion, some of the most profound existential questions we have ever faced in the history of the human race. I mean, we are literally staring aliens in the face right now in the form of artificial intelligence. We're constantly talking about, are we ever going to see aliens? Blah blah blah. They're amongst us now in many ways. Like we're around things that are close to being conscious, and how we deal with that, how we interact with technology, whether we put guardrails around it, those are the most important questions facing humanity. The most important questions facing humanity are not scientific questions or philosophical questions, and we need people with some training in that area. So I kind of got lucky, and then I ended up going to law school. And what is the law, Ivan? The law is the manifestation of a society's ethics. In other words, we think it is unethical to kill people. We think it is unethical to steal their property. And so the law is a real world manifestation of the society's ethics. So they're all, the computer science, the law, the philosophy, is it's all kind of connected in a way, and it's getting more and more connected.
It is indeed. Oh la la, you made me think about so many things from the past, from the sound of this little modem back in the late 80s when it was ringing. Uh, and also you made me think about something that I also tell my daughters, is that to choose something for passion, because people like you with a combination of different streams of knowledge are capable of making the making the future professions. In fact, there is not going to be like me. I study biotechnology. No, there is going to be a person who can mix different streams of knowledge in order to apply it in the real world. And that's something that we are already seeing as a trend in careers. Brian, I want to come back to the core of this discussion, which is understanding what is what we call the right thing. So there is different interpretations. So in at work, if I remember correctly, following the compliance of the rules of work was what was rewarded. And then you observe things that could be openly discussed as non-ethical or gray zone. And we see it in our leaders. And then when we see it, we mime these behaviors because we believe that in order to survive in a corporation, we need to have a little bit of both. Using up this gray zone in order to thrive at work and progress in your career. You cannot just obey the law uh, without playing around with these gray zones. According to you, what would you say are the most important ethical principles that leaders in the workplace should have?
Yeah, that is a very good question. A very good question. I actually have my own podcast where I interview. It's called Lessons from Leaders. I interview leaders. I've done almost 100 shows at this point, and you see patterns. Like if you pay attention, you see patterns. And the number one pattern that I've seen from all these successful leaders, and I'm talking about military generals, sports stars, social workers, judges, New York Times bestselling authors, the number one thing I see across the board is good leaders know that their job is to serve the people they lead. That's number one. So you have to start out with the idea in your mind, whatever you're doing, that your job is not to all these people that work for you or do your bidding, their job is not to serve you. Your job is to serve them. And if you serve them, then they will serve you. But that's where it has to start. Like there's a as a lawyer, I'm really interested in the science of persuasion. And I can tell you the number one rule of persuasion. I can actually tell you the number one and the number two rule of persuasion. Pay real careful attention to this because this is super important. You cannot persuade anybody of anything unless they feel like you're on the same team with them.
Hmm.
So if you start a persuasive argument by disagreeing with somebody, you will never succeed because what happens when I disagree with you, Ivan, immediately in your brain, you start coming up with reasons why I'm wrong. Whereas if I say, you know what, Ivan, you're right about that. I agree with you. I think you're 100% right about what you said. In fact, I would go even further than that. Now you're thinking, oh boy, this person's smart. This person agrees with me. And then you can say, and in fact, I agree with you on everything, but have you considered this part too? I mean, this might be something we want to think about. And then all of a sudden you're working with me. The number two rule, by the way, of persuasion is tell stories. So start with agreement and tell stories. I think the best leaders, they start by showing people with their actions, not their words, showing people their actions that the people you lead come first. So I'll give you an example of that. As a lawyer, all lawyers are supposed to say the clients come first. Not true in my law firm. My employees and my staff come before the clients. They will always come before the clients, and it's not even close.
Hmm.
And the thing about that is the funny thing about that is if you show your employees that by your actions, then they will treat the clients so good that the clients will be treated well too. So in other words, there's a like even if you're selfish, there's a selfish reason
Hmm.
to treat your employees first. And then the third thing I'll say is that, and it's interesting how you use the example of a corporation. Okay. You got to be really, really careful when you're working in, especially a big corporation, not to let the corporate rules uh, get in the way of your ethics. And the corporate form, in many ways, is designed to disperse responsibility. So here's an example. A couple of decades ago, there was a car company in the United States that built a car that was catching on fire when people hit it from 10 miles an hour from the rear and burning people alive.
Hmm.
And there were engineers at the car company that knew ahead of time that was going to happen. They also knew how to fix it. It was a 25-cent fix. but they decided that it was too expensive and they would rather pay for the 160, roughly 160 people that would burn alive in the most excruciating death possible. They said that that trade-off is worth it. What kind of person would sit in a room and say, I am knowingly going to incinerate 160 families, kids, moms, people like that, in exchange for a little bit more money? That is about as evil as you can get, right? But the point of it is the people that are making these decisions aren't evil people. They're not even bad people.
Hmm.
In fact, they're probably good people. But the incentives that they've got in the corporation are what causes them to do bad things. So the third point I want to make is we need to incentivize, however we do that, the behavior that we like to see. In other words, in the United States, by law, corporations are required to put profit first. They're required legally to do that. Okay. And that results in some very, very good things, but it also results in some bad things. And it doesn't have to be that way. For example, we could have a rule that says corporations have to put profit at the top, but they also have to put the impact on the stakeholders, which would include the people in the community and things like that. They have to prioritize that as well. We could say that. And if we said that, they would act differently. There would be different incentives. So the point is there's all these incentives that are, some of them are invisible to us, that are constantly pushing us in certain directions, good or bad. And so it's really important, I think, that we make sure, and like you said, if in a corporation, that you set the incentives up to where it encourages people to do ethical things.
Hmm. It sounds familiar, it sounds good, but the reality is that us as human beings, we want to survive. We want to, we are constantly in fear that somebody is going to take our next position,
Yeah.
fear of being fired if we don't perform in terms of what we are judged today. If it is sales, it is sales. If it is about
Yep.
winning cases, it is winning cases. If it is about winning the election, oh, you guys are on election soon. And that's where we tend to flow the game. Our brain is constantly producing fear molecules around so that we take decisions based on this fear of losing something. And that produces a lot of ethical dilemmas that people like us, and probably you, once upon a time, you have been facing dilemmas that were
Yeah.
hard to take decisions. Um, what is your thought about these ethical dilemmas that leaders or normal people live in the workplace today? What have you observed, Brian?
Well, that's really, I mean, when you're faced with an ethical dilemma like that, that's really why it's important to have some sort of operating system, some sort of ethical operating system. So, if you've never thought about these questions, when you're faced with a dilemma, an ethical dilemma, and you can go one way or the other, it's almost like random chance, right? Like you haven't thought about it, you don't have some sort of guiding principle. I have a rule, so I have three kids, and I have a rule that if it's between one of their events and some sort of work event, I go to my kids' thing every single time, unless it's like some super duper really important work thing and it's not really a big kid thing. But that's like my operating system. And so when I get invited to go to a work dinner or go have drinks, I don't have to think about it because I've already set the ethical system up. And so the question is kind of already answered. If I have a client that calls my office and cusses out my staff and I tell them to stop doing it and they do it again, I fire them. I do that. I'll fire a client in a heartbeat. No, most of the time I don't have to do that because I have fantastic clients. But if they're a jerk to my staff, it's not. In other words, I'm not sitting there thinking in my mind, do I take the side of the client or do I take the side of my staff? I've already thought about this. I already have a guiding principle that says I will always put my staff first. So I think it's important that we think about these things and talk about these things ahead of time, because oftentimes when you're faced with the decision in the heat of the moment, it's really hard to be contemplative, right? Like if you're right there in the middle of something and you have to choose between two tough decisions and you haven't thought about guiding principles beforehand, you're not, it's not like you have a lot of time to think about utilitarianism versus Kantianism, right? You're not going to be thinking about, well, do I take the consequential approach or do I take the Kantian approach? You're just going to take an approach. And so, and by the way, this is kind of a good thing for life in general is if you set up your environment, set up your habits, set up your principles in a certain way, it makes everything a lot easier. My dad is the most organized guy I have ever met in my life. I mean, he puts everything on his bathroom sink in the same spot every single time. Like if I move his shaving cream to the other side, he thinks it's gone because he won't even look to the other side. He's got everything, I mean, beyond organized, but it makes his life easier, right? The point of like the discipline of that organization is actually a way to freedom. Because if you don't have that organization, you don't have that discipline, you're going to be all over the place all the time. It's the same exact thing with ethics. If you don't have an organized system of ethics in your mind, then it's just going to be essentially random chance. So for example, I have this thing I say a lot of the time to people. I say, whether you're ethical or not, if you want to make yourself feel better, go do something good for somebody. It will absolutely make you feel better than doing something good for yourself, number one. And number two, even if you're a selfish asshole, you should do it for selfish reasons, right?
Indeed.
So my point is like if I'm in a bad mood or if I'm feeling down or depressed about something, I've already got a system in place where I know if I want to cheer myself up or something like that, I'll send one of my kids a text, "Hey, I'm super proud of you. Hope you're having a great day." They'll send me something back, and all of a sudden I feel better, right? Or I say something to somebody in line at the grocery store, "Boy, man, you must work out. You're in great shape. What do you do?" And it's amazing how that makes not only the recipient feel great, but it makes you feel good too. But the point I'm trying to bring up as far as ethics goes is we need to think about these things. We need to debate these things, discuss these things, and then we need to have a system in place. So when the the rubber hits the road, when it's go time, you already kind of know what to do.
Brian, I got a little bit like impressed. So in one shot, in the tips that you are mentioning, so you have been discussing about anchoring, which basically having a reminder why you are doing the things as that the way you do. So in your
Yeah,
case, it was looking at the children. That's something that will remind you, prepare you for the long journey that you have ahead, but that has already preconditioned your brain about so that you have a beginning that it will remind you why you are doing certain things and why you are not doing certain things. You have
yeah,
mentioned another thing that is kind of, I would call it mindfulness. So, which it is the possibility to train yourself to have options. That means between emotional reactions that you're going to have in between in the stressful journey of the workplace, uh,
yeah,
to practice the moment to activate, in fact, the rational side of your brain, so that you can take decisions based on objectivity. The third thing that you have mentioned, I hope that you identified it correctly, is about habit formation, having routines that will help you out in your decisions if they are ethical or not. But let me just add to that these two last things, mindfulness and habit formation, is not something that you can practice in order to be ethical when it comes the decision to be ethical. You have to prepare it way before.
yeah,
Your
yeah,
system, you call it system, which is the right word. You need to have a systematic way of so that when it happens, you are ready to take the decision in one shot. You cannot just take the three principles that you have mentioned and practice it in one go. Practice is what is consistency of these practices makes that one person can have ethics in on top of everything that we have to do. Did I understand it correctly, Brian?
You did. Yeah, that was well said. Very well said. Yeah. Yeah, and you know, it's just like anything, really. I think it's like a muscle. You know, your ethical framework is something that you can practice and you can get stronger at and you can ask questions about. And, you know,
Mm,
one of the things that I try to do is question my own ethics all the time. Like, am I right about this? Should I modify this? Is there an exception to this rule? You know,
mm,
I used to drive a Tesla. I drive a pickup truck now, but I used to drive a Tesla, and so I was watching like how the self-driving computer was learning. And one of the things that occurred to me is like, what do you do if you've got a self-driving car and there's a kid that runs out, 2-year-old kid that runs out chasing a soccer ball, and the car has a decision to swerve and miss that child, but it's going to run into a mother and a father who are walking down the street. So you got two choices there, and there's no third choice. What do you do?
mm,
I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. Uh, but it's a question that needs to be asked because
mm,
there will be a situation that what if you're driving down the highway and there's a busload of Catholic nuns and you're about to slam right into them, and the choice that the car has is to swerve and drive you off a cliff?
mm,
You know, what do you do there? I don't know the answer to that question either,
mm,
but I know it's a question we need to be talking about. Like, it's a question we need to be thinking about. And so I guess my point is, you know, I'm kind of I would call myself, there's basically, in my view, two very broad ethical systems that are fairly well established. There's utilitarianism or consequentialism, which comes from John Stuart Mill, that essentially says the greatest good for the greatest people. And then there's Kantianism, which is Immanuel Kant, which is like the categorical imperative, which is more about you set up a system of rules and then you follow them no matter what. And there's good pieces and bad pieces to both of those rules. Like, I think it is foolhardy not to consider the consequences of an action. Like, I think that's kind of as basic as it gets. But on the other hand, you want to have a set of kind of guiding principles or rules so you're not making it up on the fly every single time. Right now in my life, my current view is more in line with the Buddhist view, which is in general to seek the middle path. So the extremes on either end of most decisions are usually not good. And so I'm trying to, like, politically, morally, ethically, I'm trying not to be on one extreme or the other. I suppose there's times when you would want to be on the extreme, but I think those are pretty rare.
mm. You know, something that came to my mind when you were just mentioning your last point is that in every human being we have, if we put for the time being religion aside, we have the evil and the good.
Yeah.
So if we are capable of accepting the non-deterministic view that this is how we are, and our job is to tame the beast that we have inside because it's inside of us, inside of us, that adds a little bit into the responsibility of human beings about taking the right decisions. It's not because you're following Bible, Torah, or Quran that you're doing the right thing. It is because you have accepted that you have both the positive and negative side inside of you, and that your job is to control this beast inside of you.
Yeah.
And things could go better ethically if we are capable of judging ourselves in an intrinsic way, not depending on something that was written by someone.
Yeah, and you know, he brought up something there that I think is a totally fascinating discussion, and that is determinism. And you know, are we basically? I think what you mean by that is, do we have free will, or is everything predetermined? And that is it. I mean, we could do a whole 2-hour podcast about that topic. But the point is, as it relates to ethics, it doesn't matter. whether we have free will or not. What matters is what we do. And whether you can choose to behave ethically or not, whether you have free will or not, whether everything is predetermined from the moment you're born or the moment the universe is started, doesn't matter when it comes to the ultimate ethical choices.
Mm,
And the other thing I'll say is, this gets back to incentives, is let's assume for a moment that we don't have free will. Let's assume everything is completely deterministic. And I for one, do not believe that is true. I think at a bare minimum, there's an element of chaos in every deterministic system, just from a pure physics standpoint. So if you allow room for any bit of randomness at all, or any bit of chaos at all, then you're not deterministic anymore.
mm,
Like deterministic, you're either determined or you're not. And if
mm,
you're not, then there is some element of non-determinism in there. But let's assume for a moment that everything is predetermined and you have no ability to make any choice about anything. We can still set up systems that encourage deterministic ethical behavior. And so, in other words, free will, I think people worry that if there is no free will or everything's predetermined, then it doesn't matter what you do, right? Like so let me give you just an extreme example. Let's say you have somebody who is a serial killer. Oh, they were raised in certain neurons in their brain when they were in the womb, and their mom was smoking crack, and their dad was a horrible person, and this was a path they were set on. Well, does that mean all of a sudden that we don't put them in jail if we catch? I mean, of course not. And what that does is it focuses on the behaviors. It doesn't focus on the intentions,
mm,
right? Because intentions assume free will.
mm,
Intention, by definition, means you have the ability to make a different decision, right? I mean that's assumed, but we don't know if that's true or not.
mm.
So it doesn't matter. What matters is your actions, and what matters is the incentives we put together to encourage people to be ethical, and that is irrespective and outside of the question about whether things are determined or not. Does that make sense?
It does, it does. And to tell you the truth, I completely agree. What matters is the actions, and it doesn't even matter the reason why you are doing it. Sometimes you have been using the word, let's do it for a selfish reason. It is a
Yeah.
reason. What
Yeah.
matters is the outcome. So dot, and that's what should determine any ethical behavior. Now, we have been discussing about the ethical dilemmas and what we should do as an individual. What are the considerations to have when we are confronted with ethical dilemmas? Now, how should leader act as a multiplier so that his team or her team becomes also ethically equipped? Is there a way other than role modeling to encourage this type of behaviors across teams and across, why not, the culture of a corporation?
Yeah, I'll say something like my dad used to tell me all the time. I think my dad's a very, very wise guy. And he used to say, people know the difference between right and wrong. You know the difference. I don't have to have a 500-page human relations HR manual for you to know the difference between when you're being ethical and when you're not being ethical. You don't need a manual to know that you can't walk up to some woman at work and grab her butt or something. No, you don't need that. You don't need a manual to know that when your boss asks you a question, you need to tell him an honest answer and not lie to him. We all know this, right? And I think we make things far too complicated. So I would get back to, as a leader, it's in many ways, it's like my experience as a parent. My kids do not care what I tell them. They just don't. And neither do yours, and neither do anybody else's. They care what you do, period. And so you can talk all you want about this and that. Oh, it's like funny. I see these high school kids and they get caught drinking beer or something, and their parents are berating them about drinking beer. And then 2 hours later, they're getting drunk at night. I mean, it's like, what's your kid going to do when he sees that? He's going to hear you saying one thing and doing another, and they're going to follow what you do, and they're also going to think you're a hypocrite, quite frankly. So I think, again, the leader's job is to act, like to manifest the ethics. And like when and I'll tell you, when you can see that the most is when things get tough. And so in my business, for example, trial law, we run into some we run into a lot of ethical issues, and we run into a lot of difficult decisions. And I know when my team asks me to make a decision that they're looking at me, and because whatever decision I make, they're going to follow that ethical philosophy, whatever was behind it, in the next time and the next time and the next time. So I'm really somebody who is, I want to see what you do, quite frankly. I mean, I don't really want to hear all the slogans. I don't want to read your 500-page HR manual. I don't want to go to a bunch of classes where you tell me treat people fairly and nicely. I don't want some DEI weirdo to tell me that every single black person should be treated special, or every single white person is bad. I don't need that shit. And nobody else does either, quite frankly. We make this far too complicated. It's really simple, in my view. It's like the golden rule: treat people with respect and dignity, and they will treat you with respect and dignity. And if they don't, it's not your problem, it's their problem.
I really agree with what you're saying, but the problem is that our brain is a little bit, let me use the word that I'm thinking, fucked up. So the thing is that we are influenced by what we see, what people tell us, so that, for instance, we can decide that a given community is not behaving good. Maybe they deserve to be, we need to be a little bit more harder with that community. Let's say the Peruvians in Switzerland are not behaving correctly, so we associate all the Peruvians to, say, thieves. And that allows
There's no such thing as Peruvians, though. That's where you're wrong. There's no such thing as corporations. There's no such thing as institutions. There's no such thing as Americans. There's no such thing as white people. These are categories that
uh-huh.
describe a broad group of people. There are only people. There are only individuals. And you hear all the time, like, this corporation did this or that, or this institution did this or that. No, it didn't. There's no such thing. Individual people in that corporation made those decisions.
Mm,
And so I like that's what I'm getting at is, and to me, this is an ethical red line. The moment we start treating people as members of groups, we've crossed over the ethical line. That is absolutely one of the most poisonous philosophies that I'm aware of. And the reason for that is because it robs people of their individual agency. It pretends like people don't have individual agency. Like, what group would you put me in, right? Am I a Texan? Am I an Irishman? Am I an American? Am I an athlete? I, I'm none of those things, really. I'm all those things and none of those things. But what I really am is I'm an individual with agency. And that's how we should treat people. And I think we have to be super duper careful when we start talking about fictions, right? Like, a
mm,
corporation does not exist. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as a government, really. There is no such thing as a Peruvian. Okay. What is a Peruvian? It is somebody that happened to live on a certain piece of land that we've defined as Peru, right?
mm,
That's it. And that's ethically irrelevant. That's ethically meaningless. Like, the fact that you happen to be born on a certain piece of dirt in a certain geographical location that we have a certain name for should tell me absolutely nothing about whether you're an ethical person or not. But what we often do is, like, and this is, I mean, we see this in politics, for instance, we have to have an enemy.
mm,
And so who are the enemy right now? Well, Hamas is the enemy of Israel, and Israel is the enemy of Hamas, and Ukraine, and this, and we have to, but what this does is this this clouds the fact that there are individual people in Hamas that are good people and bad people. There are individual people in Israel that are good people and bad people. And we have to just be really careful about robbing people of their individual agency.
I like that. Uh, is it then our responsibility as individuals to be able to judge every single piece of information that we receive from wives, news, all over? Are we accountable for that? Because we can be, according to the newspaper that I read, and by the way, it happens to me that I compare CNN with Fox News just
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
to have
I
the
love
two.
doing that. It's like different worlds.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
it's
is
like,
it our responsibility to judge, to incentivize ourselves to get deeper into the information in order to take the right decisions and not knowing, in fact, that the information spread might be highly biased?
it's absolutely we have a responsibility to do that. In fact, the more intelligent you are, the more self-aware you are, the more responsibility you have, and also the more chance there is that you're going to get fooled. Like everybody has bias. Like I tell people, oh man, you got all these cognitive biases, and everybody's like, what about you? What about you? And I'm like, man, I got them too. That's my point. And you know what? Here's the thing. Even if you know that you have them, even if you know what they are, you're going to have them anyway. In fact, the people that know that here's kind of a brain twister. People that know the most about cognitive biases tend to have the most cognitive biases because
Indeed.
they think they don't have the same biases that everybody else does. So like I try to be super duper. I make no claims about being bias free. The only thing I say is I try to pay really, really careful attention to the fact that I'm not bias free. Does that make me bias free? No. Does that maybe make me a little more self-aware than the next person? Absolutely. And the problem is there's a large swath of our society right now that have zero agency and they don't even realize it. Like the internet and social media, like you're saying, all this basically propaganda out there has completely robbed people of many people of their individual agency. And that earlier in the podcast we were talking about ethics and technology, and that is a huge, huge deal. There's a great science fiction writer named Neil Stevenson who came out with a book a couple years ago. In the first part of the book, he talks about a society where essentially half the population has no agency. All they do is stare at screens all the time. And there's a nuclear attack on the Moab facility in America. And they realized 6 months later the whole thing was a hoax, but half of the country believed it because they didn't have the ability anymore to question whether what they were reading was true. So, absolutely, I think we have a strong ethical duty to constantly question everything we see, everything we read. Everybody's got an incentive of some sort. CNN and Fox News, their incentive is to make people mad at each other. And that's how they get paid. And in fact, I think 24-hour news is one of the worst things that happened in human history. Like, this is bad stuff. I mean, they literally get paid for making people pissed off at each other. Like, I think we're going to look back at this in 100 years, at least I hope we are, and we're going to say, what were we thinking? Why were we doing this to each other? Right? Like, I mean, you watch Fox News and you would think that the people on the left were hated America and wanted to kill all of the right wingers. And if you look at, CNN, you would think that every single right winger was a Nazi. And these people are doing it on purpose. And why are
Mhm.
they doing it? To make money. And so I think, I mean, it really is it's a bad system with bad incentives. But, like my dad says, my dad likes to watch Fox News. He said, well, it makes me happy.
That's a good one.
I was like, at least you're honest, at least you're honest. So, but anyway, like I said, I'm probably, actually, I am just as guilty of all the same biases that everybody else is. The only difference, I think, is people that try to just accept the fact that they're biased. Like, I accept the fact that because of the way I grew up, because of the books I've read, because of the things I've experienced, I'm going to have a certain worldview, and and it's not perfect, but hopefully it's good enough.
I want to repurpose one word that you mentioned. You used the word intelligence when we were discussing about our responsibility to judge the source of information. Um, and I don't know if this is the most appropriate word. And I would have said more wisdom, because intelligence for me is mainly driven for in the society is mainly driven by the knowledge acquisition. But here, wisdom is converting this knowledge into a critical thinking path, uh, uh, a judgment out of all these sources of information. So I would personally feel more comfortable with wisdom. But is it? What do you think, Brian?
That is a much better way to put it. So, and I hope this doesn't sound wrong. I'm more educated than my dad. In
Mhm.
many ways, people would say I'm more intelligent than my dad, but my dad is far wiser than I have ever been,
Exact.
and I would rather be wise
Mm.
than intelligent. And so, like, and I don't really. My dad's a smart guy. He has a college and a master's degree, so he's well educated. He's a fan of history. He knows a lot of things. So he's really smart, but what he really has is he has wisdom. He has good judgment. And I can't tell you how often I have been 100% convinced that he was wrong and I was right. And I'd pull my hair out. Dad, don't you see it? Dad, blah, blah, blah. And I look back and, on some of these things and I'm like, gosh dang, he was absolutely correct. He is wiser than I am. And, if I am half as wise as him, I will be a very happy person. There's a great book that gives a good illustration of this. There's a book called The Fabric of Reality by David Deutsch. He's a physicist, and or The Beginning of Infinity. I think he's written two books, and he gives an example of the statue of uh, Nelson in Trafalgar Square in London, and he says you could ask somebody how that statue got there, and you could get different kinds of answers. So one answer you could get from a physicist is, well, at the start of the universe, the Big Bang happened, and then, there was this explosion, and then these fundamental particles started doing this and that, and then the statue is composed of, all these quantum elements and blah, blah, blah. And you know what that would tell you about how that statue, I would literally tell you almost nothing. Where is it? You could have a different kind of explanation where you could say, well, in the 1700s, the French were at Britain's door, and Admiral Nelson led a brave naval campaign, and he died during the campaign. And so they put a statue in Trafalgar Square to remember him. That tells you way more about why that statue's there than the physical explanation. The physical explanation is technically correct, but it has no explanatory power, right?
Mm.
So which person is smart? Which person gives you a better answer? I would say it's person number two. It's kind of the same thing like with computer science. I used to be able to program a computer in hexadecimal language, which is about as close to the bit level as you can get. I can't do that anymore. I could learn it again, but is that going to help me explain artificial intelligence or chat GPT? No, of course not. Like, I would rather have somebody say chat GPT is basically a prediction algorithm that has a little calculus and a little recursion built in than have them say, well, it's programmed at the hexadecimal level and blah, 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 blah. That would tell me absolutely nothing about it. And to me, that's the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence is the ability to describe things accurately at basically every level. Wisdom is the ability to describe things in a way that people understand.
Indeed. Oh, Brian, I think this is an amazing learning experience for me, because let me recap a little bit what I understood. So we have been discussing that it is in order to be an ethical person, it is our responsibility to be able to judge information.
Yeah.
So it's, I mean, it's not because you are looking at always at the same news that or the same papers describing how you should be behaving inside of the workplace that's enough. We need to use our own judgment. I really like this part where you were discussing that everybody, you, me, we live with the acceptance that we have biases. And
Yeah.
that's already a good argument. If we know that we live with these biases, then we are going to be trying to control, tame the beast that is making us take stupid judgments.
Yeah.
Uh, the other thing is that we have mentioned a little bit the certain how do you say certain gym or exercises that we should be doing in order to practice being an ethical leader. We have been discussing about a little bit about the anchoring, remembering why we are doing the things of the day to day. So it can be children, it can be your wife, or it can be your mother, whoever is the inspiration or the most appropriate value that is going to drive most of your decisions in the day. You have to have a trigger, a reminder. We have been discussing about this practice. Well, you didn't use the word mindfulness, but I transform it in my own language. The option of practicing to don't being led by emotions, but having the moment of pause in order to take the right decisions. We have been talking about habit formation because is the continuous practice, consistency in the practice that is going to make you an ethical leader. We have been discussing also about how important is not in reality what you think about something, but it's more about the action that you take. No matters the reason why this action comes, even if it is because your own good, it doesn't matter. The ethical outcome is what is going to be the basis of a judgment to know if somebody is ethical or not. Brian, what have I forgotten about this discussion?
I think I no, I think that's a fantastic, fantastic summary. And again, the job of philosophy is to ask the important questions. It's like a compass. Okay. So, and I kind of compare it to New Year's. I used to have these New Year's resolutions and I would never reach them. Like I would reach a couple of them, and so I kind of got down on resolutions. But then I realized a couple years ago that they're a compass. They point you in a direction. They don't necessarily help you ultimately succeed. You may not get there, but at least your direction is appropriate. And that's what philosophy is. Philosophy asks the questions to get us looking in the right direction. And is that going to solve all our problems? Of course not. Are we going to be wrong just as much as we're right? Yes. But at least we're oriented in the right way. And to me, that's the most important thing. The most important thing I think we need to keep in mind around ethics is it's the individual human being that matters. It's not the institutions, it's not the groups, it's not the men versus women, it's not the South American versus North American. We're all at the end of the day the same. We're all human beings and we have to treat people as individual agents. And if we start from that premise, I think it makes everything a lot easier, if that makes sense. Like, I think there's oftentimes institutions and corporations generate decisions that forget about the fact that there are consequences to individual human beings for these decisions, and they forget about that. And if we would just remember that when we're making decisions, I think that would be a really, really good start.
Excellent. Brian, how can people that is listening to this conversation, who is just getting the angle about you as somebody who understands ethics, somebody who understands philosophy, and beyond that, I mean, you are a law attorney. How can they reach you out?
So type Brian Beckcom. It's a weird spelling, Beckcom. It's like Beck.com, Beckcom. I'm all I'm all over the internet. My law firm's VB Attorney, V as in Victor, B as in Brian, VB Attorneys. The podcast is Lessons from Leaders. And if you just type any of those things in, I'm all over the place. I'm probably most active on Instagram. I like Instagram a lot, although I also have a pretty active YouTube page, website, some other things. So anyway, I'd love to hear from anybody that is listening that would love to talk about any of these things. I tell people I hope you never need my services as a lawyer, but if you do, feel free to reach out. But yeah, so Ivan, what a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Brian, it was really a pleasure. I will make sure that all the links to reach you out are going to be below this episode. It was lovely to spend time with you, Brian. And as people says here in Switzerland, best friends to have is a lawyer, a policeman, and I forgot the tax advisor. So
I love
everybody
it.
remember that. Always have a friend who is a lawyer, tax advisor, or policeman.
Nice.
Have an excellent day, Brian.
Thank you, Ivan.